Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, to a time when laughter, that simple, joyful outburst, faced an unlikely foe. Imagine, if you will, a Rome where the bustling forum is eerily quiet, where the playful shouts of children are hushed, and even the wine-soaked revelry of a dinner party is subdued. You're walking the ancient cobblestones, the scent of baking bread and something vaguely equine wafting from the side streets, and you feel a strange tension in the air. People smile, perhaps, but it's a careful, almost conspiratorial smile, never quite reaching their eyes. A joke whispered too loudly might earn you a nervous glance, or worse, the attention of a passing guard. Yes, tonight you're entering the bizarre reign of an emperor who, if the whispers are to be believed, truly attempted to ban laughter. You probably wouldn't survive a day without a giggle fit, let alone an empire where mirth was monitored. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins with Elagabalus, an emperor whose name now conjures images of decadence and almost cartoonish eccentricity. But beneath the layers of historical sensationalism, there lies a fascinating, albeit bewildering figure. He ruled Rome, or rather Rome endured his rule, for a mere 4 years, from 218 to 222 AD. Yet, in that brief flicker of time, he managed to etch his name into the annals of history as one of its most peculiar characters. He wasn't just a quirky leader, he was a walking, talking, toga-wearing challenge to every Roman tradition. You see, the Romans, for all their seriousness about law and order, loved a good laugh. They enjoyed bawdy plays, satirical poems, and the occasional ribald joke at the expense of their politicians. Sound familiar? Laughter was woven into the fabric of their daily life, a common release valve in a society that could be remarkably rigid. The idea of trying to ban it, or even just subtly discourage it, strikes us as utterly absurd, almost comical in its futility. But that's exactly the kind of whimsical yet deeply unsettling notion that bubbled up during Elagabalus's reign. Historians still argue whether his supposed ban on laughter was a literal edict or a hyperbolic description of the oppressive atmosphere he cultivated. Was it a genuine state-sanctioned crackdown on merriment, or simply the natural byproduct of a ruler so profoundly alien to Roman sensibilities that joy withered in his presence? We'll explore the evidence, or lack thereof, as we drift deeper into his world. For now, simply imagine the weight of enforced solemnity, the bizarre silence where boisterousness once reigned, and consider how profoundly unsettling that would be. It's a truly fringe tidbit of Roman history, one that seems almost too strange to be true, and yet it encapsulates the utterly unique nature of this young emperor. His story, like so many ancient tales, begins with a dash of drama and a sprinkle of divine intervention, or at least the appearance of it. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus, he would eventually be known as Elagabalus, a name derived from the Syrian sun god Elagabal. He wasn't born into the direct imperial line, but rather he hailed from a prominent priestly family in Emesa, modern-day Homs, Syria. Imagine, if you will, a powerful family so intertwined with religious authority that their influence stretched far beyond mere local politics. His grandmother, Julia Mesa, was a shrewd and ambitious woman, sister to the formidable Empress Julia Domna. This familial connection was his golden ticket, though he wouldn't realize it immediately. You see, the Roman Empire in the early 3rd century AD was a bit of a chaotic mess. Emperors came and went with alarming regularity, often dispatched by disgruntled soldiers or ambitious rivals. It was a time of intense political instability, where military might rather than hereditary right often dictated who sat on the throne. After the assassination of Emperor Caracalla, Julia Mesa saw an opportunity. Her grandson, Elagabalus, was at this point serving as the chief priest of Elagabal, a position of considerable spiritual power and influence in their native Syria. He was young, charismatic in his own way, and crucially had a rather striking appearance, often depicted in luxurious priestly robes, perhaps a touch too flamboyant for the average Roman. Mesa, with the help of her daughters, cleverly circulated rumors that Elagabalus was, in fact, Caracalla's illegitimate son. This was a masterstroke of ancient propaganda. Caracalla, for all his faults, was still popular with the legions, particularly those stationed in the east. To suddenly produce a secret heir who shared a supposed familial connection was a stroke of genius. Think of it as the ultimate reality TV reveal, but with empires at stake. The soldiers, perhaps weary of the current Emperor Macrinus, and certainly swayed by the lavish promises and fervent religious devotion of Elagabalus's entourage, eagerly backed the young priest. It's one of those mainstream historical facts that underpins so much of Roman political maneuvering. The army's loyalty was paramount, and often easily bought. So, at the tender age of 14, Elagabalus was proclaimed emperor by the legions in Emesa. Can you imagine the scene? A young man, barely out of childhood, suddenly thrust onto the grand stage of Roman power, not through military conquest or senatorial decree, but through a cunning blend of religious zeal and familiar politicking. It's a truly bizarre origin story for a Roman emperor, setting the stage for a reign that would be anything but conventional. He embraced his role as high priest of Elagabal with far more enthusiasm than his duties as Roman emperor, a key factor in his later controversies. Historians still argue whether Julia Mesa truly believed her grandson was Caracalla's son, or if it was a purely cynical ploy. Regardless, it worked. The legions marched, a battle was fought, and Macrinus was swiftly defeated, leaving the path to Rome open for the boy emperor. It's a testament to how quickly power could shift in the Roman Empire, often on the whim of a few influential individuals and the eager support of a well-bribed army. This unexpected ascent, driven by a quirky tidbit of fabricated lineage and religious fervor, positioned him for a reign unlike any other. His arrival in Rome was, to put it mildly, not what the seasoned Roman populace was expecting. You see, when a new emperor rode into the Eternal City, there were certain expectations. Dignity, perhaps. A triumphant military parade, certainly. A general air of gravitas. Elagabalus, however, had other ideas. He didn't arrive as a conquering general or a stoic statesman. He arrived as the high priest of a foreign sun god, and he was determined to bring his deity, Elagabal, with him. This wasn't just a quirky personal devotion. It was a full-scale religious reform, intended to elevate Elagabal above all other Roman gods, even Jupiter himself. Imagine the collective gasp of the Roman senators, who had spent centuries upholding their pantheon, their rituals, and their very distinct separation of state and foreign cults. It was like suddenly declaring that the national bird was now a flamingo, and everyone had to wear pink. His first act upon entering the city was to construct a massive temple, the Elagabalium, on the Palatine Hill, one of Rome's most sacred spots. This wasn't just any temple. It was designed to house the sacred black stone, a meteorite, which was the physical embodiment of the god Elagabal. This stone, an aniconic representation, meaning it wasn't shaped like a human or animal, was brought from Emesa with much fanfare. You can almost hear the grumbling from the traditionalists. They're bringing a rock into the city and calling it a god? What's next, a talking donkey? It was a mainstream historical fact that the Romans were generally open to adopting foreign gods, but usually by assimilating them into their existing pantheon, or at least giving them a quiet corner. Elagabalus wasn't interested in quiet corners. He wanted his god to be the god. He even decreed that senators, the august and usually rather stuffy leaders of Rome, had to attend daily rituals honoring Elagabal. And these weren't your typical solemn Roman sacrifices. These involved chanting, dancing, and sometimes even self-mutilation by his Syrian priests. Picture a distinguished Roman senator, perhaps one who had seen decades of public service, shuffling awkwardly through a ritual involving ecstatic dancing, probably wondering if his toga was getting too dusty. It was a cultural clash of epic proportions, and it deeply unsettled the Roman elite. They were used to a certain decorum, a certain stately rhythm to their religious life. This was loud and foreign and, frankly, a bit embarrassing. Perhaps the most astonishing and quirky tidbit of his religious zeal was his attempt to marry Elagabal to various Roman goddesses. First, he tried to marry his god to Minerva, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. When that proved unpopular, he then married Elagabal to the goddess Urania, identified with the Carthaginian goddess Tanit, bringing her sacred image to Rome with great ceremony. He even had a public wedding ceremony between the two deities, complete with dowries and processions. You can almost imagine the nervous laughter, quickly suppressed, as the Roman citizens watched this spectacle unfold. It was one thing to worship a new god. It was another to arrange a divine marriage with their beloved goddesses. Historians still argue whether these acts were genuine religious devotion or a deliberate provocation designed to assert his absolute authority and break down Roman traditions. Was he a true believer, utterly convinced of his god's supremacy, or was he a mischievous teenager testing the boundaries of imperial power? Either way, his religious reforms certainly made an impression, though perhaps not the one he intended. With his religious agenda firmly established, Elagabalus turned his attention to daily life at court, and this is where his eccentricities truly began to shine, or perhaps glow with a rather alarming intensity. Imagine waking up in ancient Rome, ready for a day of senatorial duties or market bartering, only to hear whispers of the emperor's latest bizarre stunt. His personal habits weren't just unusual, they were designed to shock and awe, often with a mischievous twinkle in his eye, one assumes. He wasn't subtle. Let's start with his dining rituals. Roman banquets were already legendary for their excess, but Elagabalus took it to an entirely new level. He was known for serving exotic and ridiculously expensive dishes, not always for consumption, but sometimes just for display. Think nightingale tongues, flamingo brains, and pearls dissolved in vinegar. A mainstream historical fact about Roman decadence, but Elagabalus turned it into performance art. It wasn't about the taste, it was about the spectacle and the sheer cost. One quirky tidbit claims he would sometimes serve his guests food made entirely of marble or glass, just to see their reaction. Imagine trying to politely gnaw on a marble chicken leg. And when he did serve real food, he would sometimes shower his dinner guests with flowers. Not just a gentle sprinkle, but torrents of petals, occasionally leading to guests suffocating under the sheer weight of floral exuberance. You'd be buried in roses, literally. "Oh, darling, did you enjoy the gladioli?" "Couldn't tell, I'm still extracting them from my lungs." His fashion choices were equally, shall we say, daring. While Romans typically wore simple tunics and togas, Elagabalus preferred rich, flowing robes of silk and gold, often adorned with jewels. He shunned the traditional Roman short haircut for elaborate wigs and even wore makeup, a practice generally associated with women or actors in Rome. This wasn't just a style statement, it was a deliberate rejection of Roman masculine ideals. He would appear in public with painted eyes and rouged cheeks, looking less like a stern Roman emperor and more like a deity from a far-off land, which, of course, was exactly the point. You can imagine the snickering behind cupped hands, quickly suppressed as he glided past. And then there were his pets. Forget the dignified greyhounds or trained falcons of other emperors. Elagabalus had a fondness for snakes and would reportedly release them during dinner parties, sending his terrified guests scrambling. He also kept lions and leopards, not in cages, but often loosely wandering the palace grounds. Picture a casual stroll through the imperial gardens, only to encounter a fully grown lion yawning in your path. It's enough to make you reconsider that second helping of dormouse. Historians still argue whether these extreme displays were symptoms of genuine madness, a deliberate attempt to undermine Roman norms, or simply the unchecked whims of a spoiled teenager with absolute power. Perhaps a bit of all three. Regardless, his daily life was a theatrical production designed to keep everyone on their toes and probably a little bit terrified. Beyond his bizarre public persona, Elagabalus's personal relationships, particularly his approach to gender and sexuality, were perhaps the most shocking to the conservative Roman elite. In a society that valued strict gender roles and clear lines of masculinity and femininity, Elagabalus delighted in blurring those boundaries, often in ways that scandalized even the most jaded Roman. You might recall previous emperors who had mistresses or even male lovers, but Elagabalus went far beyond the typical Roman transgressions. A mainstream historical fact about Roman emperors is their occasional penchant for grand marriages, often for political alliances. Elagabalus was no exception in marrying several women, but his choices and subsequent behavior were anything but conventional. He famously married Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin, which was a sacrilegious act, punishable by death for both parties. Vestal virgins were revered priestesses, guardians of Rome's sacred flame, and their virginity was paramount to the city's safety. To violate this vow was to invite divine wrath upon Rome. His justification? He claimed the union would produce godlike children. Imagine the horror, the utter outrage among the Roman religious establishment and the populace. It was an act of profound disrespect to their ancient traditions, seemingly done just because he could. But perhaps even more bewildering to the Romans was his open embrace of what we might today describe as gender fluidity. Ancient sources, though often biased, depict him as preferring to be called mistress rather than lord, and even seeking sex reassignment surgery. He reportedly offered vast sums of money to any physician who could perform the operation, a truly quirky tidbit that highlights his radical departure from Roman norms. While we lack the medical knowledge of the 3rd century to understand the full implications, the sheer audacity of the desire itself was astounding to his contemporaries. He would sometimes appear in public dressed as a woman or wear makeup and elaborate wigs, openly challenging the stoic, masculine ideal of a Roman emperor. He also engaged in several well-documented relationships with men, most notably with a charioteer named Heracles, whom he elevated to a position of immense power and wealth, reportedly styling him as his husband. The sources claim he would refer to Heracles as his wife. This wasn't just a private affair, it was a public display that defied every expectation of imperial conduct. Historians still argue whether his gender expression was a genuine reflection of his identity, a deliberate political statement, or merely another manifestation of his youthful excess and desire to provoke. Was he genuinely transgender, or was he a provocateur using gender nonconformity to undermine the establishment? Regardless of the underlying motivation, these actions caused immense scandal and alienated large swaths of the Roman elite, who saw his behavior as an affront to Roman virtue and an existential threat to their traditional social order. It certainly wasn't the kind of stable, predictable leadership that allowed for a relaxing night's rest. Elagabalus's whims extended far beyond his personal life and into the very architecture of Rome itself. Most emperors built monuments to their triumphs, grand public works, or perhaps impressive new forums. Elagabalus, however, had a peculiar knack for constructing things that served no apparent practical purpose, or at least purposes that only made sense within the strange labyrinth of his own mind. Imagine trying to get a building permit from that emperor. "Your Majesty, we need new aqueducts." "Nonsense, I need a revolving dining room." A mainstream historical fact about Roman emperors is their monumental building projects, often designed to solidify their legacy. But Elagabalus's projects often felt less about legacy and more about immediate gratification or outlandish amusement. One quirky tidbit describes a revolving dining room built within his palace. Now, picture yourself as a guest at one of his notorious banquets. You're trying to discreetly avoid the pearl dissolved in vinegar when suddenly the entire room begins to slowly rotate, offering you a dizzying new view of the lavish, perhaps slightly chaotic surroundings. It sounds like something out of a James Bond villain's lair, not the residence of a Roman emperor. This wasn't just a party trick, it was a display of immense wealth and technological prowess, a testament to his desire for constant novelty and spectacle. One could argue it was an early form of immersive entertainment, though probably not one designed to help you relax. He was also fond of creating artificial landscapes within his vast imperial gardens. Not just charming flower beds, but elaborate grottos, artificial lakes, and even, reputedly, areas designed for strange animal displays. You might be strolling along, enjoying the simulated wilderness, only to find yourself face to face with an exotic beast, or perhaps a gilded cage containing a particularly disgruntled lion. It's hard to imagine these being truly relaxing strolls. The purpose of these grand yet often bizarre constructions seems to have been purely for his own amusement and to shock his guests. It was the architectural equivalent of a practical joke played on an imperial scale. Then there were the more ephemeral yet equally perplexing architectural quirks. He was said to have constructed lavish baths, but not for public use. Instead, these were private spaces where he would engage in elaborate, often scandalous bathing rituals, surrounded by his personal entourage. Imagine the sheer opulence, the scented oils, the exotic perfumes, all dedicated to one man's singular and often controversial hygienic routines. It was a bizarre inversion of the Roman public bath tradition, turning a communal activity into an intensely private, almost theatrical performance. Historians still argue whether these construction projects were simply the result of boundless imperial resources meeting an immature imagination, or if they were carefully calculated acts designed to reinforce his image as a divine king above the mundane concerns of his subjects. Perhaps he genuinely found these spaces to be more conducive to his singular brand of worship and entertainment. Whatever the true motivation, his architectural whims certainly contributed to the perception of Elagabalus as an emperor unlike any other, fostering an atmosphere of constant unpredictability rather than restful calm. You definitely wouldn't want to fall asleep in one of his revolving dining rooms. Speaking of bizarre and unsettling, let's talk about Elagabalus's menagerie. While many Roman emperors kept exotic animals as symbols of power and for gladiatorial games, Elagabalus's approach to his imperial pets was, predictably, in a league of its own. It wasn't about projecting strength, it was about injecting a dose of delightful chaos into everyday life. Imagine your pet being, say, a very large, possibly ill-tempered, fanged beast. A mainstream historical fact is that wild animals were often brought to Rome from distant lands for public spectacles. The Colosseum, for instance, saw countless beasts from across the empire. Elagabalus, however, seemed to prefer his exotic creatures as personal companions rather than mere entertainment props. He was known to keep lions and leopards not just in secure enclosures, but sometimes, as mentioned earlier, roaming freely within the palace grounds. Picture yourself as a visiting dignitary, enjoying a pleasant stroll through the imperial gardens, perhaps admiring the meticulously sculpted hedges, only to turn a corner and come face to face with a lounging leopard. "Oh, excuse me, your stripy majesty, didn't see you there." It certainly wasn't the kind of relaxing environment conducive to quiet contemplation. But the real quirky tidbit about his animal antics involves his snakes. It said he would release harmless snakes, or perhaps less harmful ones, during dinner parties. Not just a few, but a veritable slithering cascade, sending his noble guests into shrieking fits of panic. Imagine the scene. You're reclining on your dining couch, enjoying a particularly succulent roasted dormouse, when suddenly a viper slithers across your lap. The subsequent dignified scramble for safety, toga-clad senators tripping over each other, must have been quite the spectacle for the emperor's amusement. One can almost hear his delighted cackle amidst the terrified screams. Was this a calculated social experiment, a way to test the mettle of his courtiers, or just the equivalent of a very high-stakes prank? He also reportedly kept wild dogs and even trained them to ride in chariots in the Circus Maximus, not in traditional races, but as part of his personal processions. Instead of stately horses, imagine a pack of snarling canines pulling the imperial chariot, probably barking at passers-by. It's a bizarre image, one that underscores his consistent desire to subvert expectations. Historians still argue whether these animal antics were purely for his entertainment, a deliberate strategy to keep his courtiers off balance and fearful, or perhaps an attempt to mimic the exotic practices of the Eastern cults he so admired. Was he genuinely fond of these dangerous creatures, or were they simply another tool in his arsenal of provocations? Regardless, his imperial menagerie was far from the serene pet ownership we might imagine today. You certainly wouldn't want to accidentally doze off in the imperial gardens only to wake up nose to nose with a slumbering lion. Beyond the personal eccentricities, Elagabalus also manipulated public games and spectacles, traditionally a cornerstone of Roman life, for his own peculiar brand of amusement and control. The Circus Maximus, the Colosseum, these were places where the Roman populace expected to be entertained, thrilled, and sometimes even inspired. But under Elagabalus, even these grand venues became stages for his unusual performances. A mainstream historical fact is that Roman emperors often used public games, or ludi, to curry favor with the populace. Providing free entertainment, often featuring thrilling chariot races and gladiatorial combats, was a sure way to win popular support. Elagabalus certainly provided games, but with a twist. Instead of just funding the usual spectacles, he inserted his own bizarre interventions. For instance, he reportedly replaced the traditional charioteers in some races with women, or even, as a quirky tidbit, with his own favorite prostitutes, much to the shock of the spectators. Imagine the roar of the crowd turning into a bewildered hush as the starting gate opens to reveal not hardened athletes, but a bewildered group of courtesans attempting to navigate a chariot. It certainly wasn't the kind of competitive racing Romans were accustomed to, and probably didn't do much for the betting pool. He also had a strange fascination with using his own imperial finances to throw gold and silver coins, along with valuable jewels, into the crowds during games. While this sounds generous, it quickly devolved into a chaotic scramble, with people injuring each other in the crush to grab the valuables. It was less about beneficence and more about instigating pandemonium, a way to observe the baser instincts of humanity for his own amusement. Imagine the scene from your vantage point in the stands, a sudden glittering shower, followed by a frantic, undignified melee of citizens fighting over trinkets. It highlights his almost childlike cruelty, a desire to create chaos simply because he could. Furthermore, his presence at these events wasn't always as a dignified spectator. He would sometimes participate, but in ways that defied imperial decorum. He reportedly took part in chariot races, not as a symbol of skill, but often to display his eccentricities or to humiliate others.
He even had his eunuchs participate in gladiatorial contests, a stark departure from the heavily trained, often enslaved combatants who usually performed. Historians still argue whether his interference in these public spectacles was a deliberate attempt to undermine Roman social order, or simply the capricious acts of a young man with too much power and too little guidance. Was he trying to exert control over the very emotions of his subjects, even their moments of joy? Or was he merely bored? Whatever the motivation, his public games were certainly not the relaxing, predictable entertainment Romans expected, contributing to the growing unease with his reign. You'd probably leave the arena more bewildered than entertained, certainly not ready for a peaceful night's sleep.
Now let's address the elephant in the ancient Roman room, the supposed ban on laughter. This is the quirky core of our story, the tidbit that makes Elagabalus truly stand out, but also the one that requires the most careful investigation. Was there really a decree, an imperial edict forbidding the innocent expression of joy? The answer, like so many things in ancient history, is a bit murky, a blend of sensationalized rumor and exaggerated truth. A mainstream historical fact is that Roman emperors often issued edicts on a wide range of topics, from taxes to public behavior. It wouldn't be entirely unprecedented for an emperor to try and control public sentiment, though usually through propaganda or suppression of dissent, rather than outright banning an emotion. However, there is no direct, concrete evidence, no surviving scroll or inscription that details an official ban on laughter issued by Elagabalus. This is a crucial point. The idea largely stems from later historical accounts, often written by hostile sources who sought to demonize Elagabalus and highlight his outrageousness. These accounts, while colorful, need to be read with a healthy dose of skepticism. So where did the legend come from? It's likely an exaggeration, or perhaps a metaphorical description, of the general atmosphere he cultivated. Imagine living under a ruler so erratic, so unpredictable, and so prone to bizarre and sometimes cruel whims that people simply became afraid to show overt joy. A loud laugh could be misinterpreted, a spontaneous burst of mirth seen as disrespect. If the emperor might release snakes at dinner parties or shower you with suffocating flower petals, you'd probably think twice before letting out a hearty guffaw. The risk of offending him or simply attracting his capricious attention would lead to a pervasive sense of apprehension. It's a quirky tidbit that suggests a psychological ban rather than a legal one. Consider the emperor's grand and sacred processions, where his black stone god was paraded through the streets. These were meant to be solemn, awe-inspiring events. If someone were to burst out laughing during such a serious religious procession, it would naturally be seen as a grave insult to the emperor and his deity. While not a ban on laughter across the board, such an act could certainly lead to severe punishment. This would contribute to the narrative that laughter was dangerous under his rule. Historians still argue whether the lack of a formal edict means the ban was entirely fabricated, or if it reflects a very real, though unofficial, chilling effect on public displays of happiness. Was it a deliberate policy to foster an atmosphere of fear, or simply an unfortunate side effect of his unpredictable reign? We may never know for certain, but the very notion of an emperor trying to ban laughter remains a testament to Elagabalus's unique place in Roman history, creating an environment where true relaxation and spontaneous joy were likely hard to find. The Romans, a people known for their pragmatic nature and their deep respect for tradition, certainly noticed Elagabalus's increasingly erratic behavior. The murmurs of discontent weren't just confined to the dinner parties where snakes might make an appearance. They rippled through all levels of Roman society, from the stoic senators to the bustling market vendors. Imagine trying to explain to your neighbor that the new emperor just married a Vestal virgin and is now trying to have his god marry Minerva. It wasn't exactly conducive to social cohesion. A mainstream historical fact is that public opinion, even in an autocratic empire, mattered. Emperors who lost the support of the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, or the Roman people often faced severe consequences. Elagabalus managed to alienate all three. The senatorial elite, accustomed to a semblance of dignity and adherence to ancient customs, found his religious reforms and personal behavior utterly abhorrent. They saw his acts as an assault on Roman identity itself. To them, he wasn't just a quirky emperor, he was a dangerous madman threatening the very fabric of their society. They would have certainly discussed his latest antics in hushed tones, perhaps over a quiet glass of wine, wondering how much longer they could endure such an affront to their gravitas. The common people, while perhaps initially intrigued by his lavish games and coin tosses, quickly grew weary of the chaos and the profound disrespect shown to their familiar gods and traditions. A quirky tidbit suggests that even the ordinary Roman citizen, who usually enjoyed a good spectacle, found his antics less entertaining and more unsettling. When your emperor is more concerned with marrying his rock god to a goddess than with maintaining the grain supply, priorities clearly seem skewed. The laughter, real or suppressed, was turning into a nervous cough of anxiety. The discontent wasn't just ideological. His financial excesses, fueled by his extravagant lifestyle and bizarre projects, began to strain the imperial treasury, leading to increased taxes and economic instability. This, more than any religious sacrilege, likely stirred the common folk to genuine anger. When your pockets are lighter, the emperor's strange habits become less amusing and more of a direct threat to your livelihood. Historians still argue whether the Roman aristocracy's opposition to Elagabalus was purely moral outrage or largely driven by their own self-interest and desire to restore a more predictable, exploitable system. Was it genuine disgust or simply political maneuvering to rid themselves of an unpredictable nuisance? Regardless, the cumulative effect of his reign was a widespread sense of unease and a growing desire for change. This environment of increasing disapproval certainly didn't create a tranquil atmosphere for a good night's sleep. As the murmurs of discontent grew louder, Elagabalus's grip on power began to loosen. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but rather a slow, creeping decline, like a grand edifice subtly cracking under unseen pressure. His reign, built on a foundation of religious zeal and youthful indulgence, simply wasn't sustainable in the face of Roman tradition and political machinations. A mainstream historical fact about Roman imperial politics is the constant threat of conspiracy. Emperors were rarely safe on their thrones, and Elagabalus, by alienating so many powerful factions, was practically inviting one. His grandmother, Julia Maeza, the very woman who had orchestrated his rise to power, quickly realized her grand experiment had gone terribly awry. She had envisioned a puppet emperor, easily manipulated to secure her family's influence. What she got was an unpredictable, sacrilegious performance artist who was actively undermining everything the Roman elite held dear. Maeza, a pragmatist to her core, knew that if Elagabalus continued on his current path, her entire family's power and perhaps even their lives would be at risk. Her solution was ruthless and strategic. She began to discreetly promote her other grandson, Alexianus, Elagabalus's cousin. Alexianus was everything Elagabalus was not: serious, traditional, and seemingly respectful of Roman customs. Maeza carefully groomed him, presenting him as a more suitable heir, a mainstream historical fact of Roman succession where ambitious women often played pivotal behind-the-scenes roles. She convinced Elagabalus to adopt Alexianus, now known as Severus Alexander, and name him Caesar, essentially designating him as his co-ruler and successor. This was a move designed to appease the military and the Senate, offering them a glimmer of hope for a return to normalcy. Elagabalus, in a moment of either naive trust or political miscalculation, agreed. Perhaps he thought sharing power would lessen his burdens, or perhaps he truly believed in his family's loyalty. But this was a classic Roman power play, and a quirky tidbit reveals that Elagabalus quickly grew jealous of Alexianus's growing popularity, even attempting to have him assassinated. Imagine the family dinners at the palace, knowing your cousin is plotting your demise, and vice versa. He tried to strip Alexianus of his title, but by then it was too late. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and the Praetorian Guard, ever watchful of the political winds, had begun to shift their allegiance. Historians still argue whether Maesa truly intended for Alexianus to replace Elagabalus from the outset, or if her actions were a desperate attempt to salvage her family's standing after Elagabalus proved uncontrollable. Either way, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would bring an end to Elagabalus's peculiar reign. The air of conspiracy and distrust was palpable, certainly not the kind of atmosphere that allowed anyone to sleep soundly.
The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite imperial bodyguard, played a pivotal role in the rise and fall of many emperors, and Elagabalus was no exception. These were not just soldiers, they were a powerful political force, capable of making or breaking a reign. Their loyalty was constantly being bought and sold, a dangerous game for any emperor who couldn't keep them happy. For Elagabalus, their shifting allegiance would prove fatal. A mainstream historical fact about the Praetorian Guard is their immense power. They were essentially the emperor's personal army, stationed in Rome, and their approval was crucial for maintaining stability. Initially, they were swayed by Julia Maesa's promises and the lure of rich donatives, the customary gifts of money given to soldiers upon an emperor's accession. They backed Elagabalus's claim, effectively putting him on the throne. However, their patience was not limitless, and their loyalty was conditional. As Elagabalus's eccentricities grew, so did the Praetorians' disillusionment. They were traditional Roman soldiers, valuing discipline and martial prowess. His effeminate dress, his foreign religious rituals, and his general disregard for Roman values would have deeply offended their sense of honor and duty. Imagine a grizzled Praetorian veteran who'd fought campaigns on the frontiers being asked to salute an emperor dressed in silken robes with painted eyes. It's a comedic image to us, perhaps, but to them it was an insult to their profession and to Rome itself. This growing disdain would have been a significant factor in their willingness to switch sides. The tension escalated dramatically when Elagabalus, consumed by jealousy, tried to revoke Alexandrinus's title as Caesar and ordered the Praetorian Guard to arrest and execute him. This was the final straw. The Guard, having already begun to favor the more traditional and seemingly stable Alexandrinus, refused. A quirky tidbit suggests that they were also influenced by Julia Maesa, who had been actively cultivating their loyalty with promises of greater rewards and a return to imperial normalcy under Alexandrinus. She knew how to play the game, and she played it masterfully. Instead of obeying Elagabalus, the Praetorians rose up in open revolt. They surrounded the imperial palace, demanding that Elagabalus present himself, along with Alexandrinus, at their camp. This was a clear act of defiance, a public humiliation of the emperor. Historians still argue whether the Praetorian Guard genuinely believed in Alexandrinus as a better ruler, or if their actions were purely motivated by the higher bribes and the desire for a less volatile regime. Were they acting out of patriotic duty or simple self-interest? Regardless, their decision sealed Elagabalus's fate. The very force that had elevated him to power was now turning against him, ushering in the violent climax of his strange and brief reign. The constant threat of military upheaval made Rome a very unsettling place to live, certainly not one where you could drift off into a peaceful slumber.
The end of Elagabalus's reign was as dramatic and unconventional as his life. Having lost the support of the Praetorian Guard, his fate was sealed. The very soldiers who had crowned him now turned into his executioners, a common, grim mainstream historical fact for many unpopular Roman emperors.
The morning of March 11, 222 AD began like any other in Rome, but it would end with a brutal and unceremonious conclusion to the reign of the sun god emperor. After the Praetorians had openly defied his order to execute Alexianus, they instead insisted that both emperors appear at their camp. Elagabalus, perhaps in a last desperate attempt to regain control or simply out of a sense of fatalism, complied. He arrived with Alexianus, surrounded by his personal retinue, including his mother, Julia Soammias, and his favorite charioteer. It was a tense standoff, an incredibly dramatic scene for anyone who might have witnessed it. Once inside the camp, the Praetorians, who had already declared their allegiance to Alexianus, made their intentions clear. They cheered for Alexianus, saluted him as emperor, and then turned on Elagabalus. Accounts vary slightly in their specifics, but the general consensus is that Elagabalus was dragged from his litter, stripped of his imperial regalia, and mercilessly cut down. His mother, Julia Soammias, who had so vigorously supported his rise and controversial reign, also met a violent end, attempting to shield her son. It was a swift, brutal, and public execution, a far cry from the dignified ends of many Roman emperors, even the bad ones. A quirky tidbit from the historical accounts states that after his death, his body was subjected to further indignities. The Praetorians, in their contempt, dragged his corpse through the streets of Rome, a public humiliation reserved for the most reviled of tyrants. They first attempted to stuff his body into the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's ancient sewage system, but it was apparently too large. Instead, his remains were eventually thrown into the Tiber River, a final, utterly undignified resting place for a man who had claimed divine ancestry. Historians still argue whether the extreme brutality and public desecration of his body were standard practice for despised emperors, or if it reflected a particular and visceral hatred for Elagabalus due to his perceived sacrileges and gender nonconformity. Was it political expediency or pure disgust? Regardless, the message was clear. Roman tradition had reasserted itself, and the chaotic reign of the sun god emperor was definitively over. You definitely would not have slept well knowing such an event could unfold on Rome's streets.
In the aftermath of his violent end, Elagabalus's memory was, predictably, subjected to a process known as damnatio memoriae. This mainstream historical fact involved the official condemnation of an individual's memory, meaning their name was erased from inscriptions, their statues destroyed, and their public records obliterated. The goal was to wipe them from history, as if they had never existed. While damnatio memoriae was never entirely successful, as we are discussing him now, it certainly shaped how subsequent generations viewed Elagabalus. For centuries, he was largely remembered as a degenerate, a perverse tyrant, and a bizarre anomaly in the long line of Roman emperors. Later historians, particularly those writing after his time and often influenced by traditional Roman biases, painted him in the darkest possible light, emphasizing his sexual deviance, his religious innovations, and his overall affront to Roman sensibilities. You'd read accounts that bordered on the fantastical, detailing his supposed depravities with a kind of morbid fascination. These narratives cemented his image as one of Rome's bad emperors, a cautionary tale of unchecked power and youthful folly. However, in more recent times, a quirky tidbit of scholarly reevaluation has begun to emerge. Modern historians, with a greater understanding of cultural relativism, gender studies, and the complexities of ancient sources, are starting to look at Elagabalus through a different lens. They question the biases of the ancient writers, many of whom were hostile to his Syrian origins and his attempts to challenge Roman norms. Was he truly a depraved monster, or was he simply a young man from a vastly different cultural background thrust into a position of absolute power, who genuinely believed in his God and expressed his identity in ways utterly alien to the Romans? For example, his gender fluidity, once condemned as perverse, is now sometimes viewed as an early, albeit extreme, expression of gender identity. His religious reforms, once seen as sacrilegious, can be interpreted as a genuine attempt to introduce a monotheistic sun cult, reflecting spiritual trends emerging in the Eastern Roman Empire. Historians still argue whether this reevaluation goes too far in excusing his excesses or if it provides a necessary corrective to centuries of biased historical judgment. Was he a misunderstood religious visionary ahead of his time, or simply a spoiled narcissistic teenager who enjoyed shocking people? This ongoing debate is a crucial part of understanding his complex legacy. It's a testament to how history is never static and how even the most infamous figures can be re-examined, prompting us to reconsider what we thought we knew. The discussion itself, a slow unraveling of ancient prejudices, might even be considered a rather soothing mental exercise as we drift towards the realm of dreams.
So, what enduring lessons can we draw from the peculiar tale of Elagabalus, the Roman emperor who allegedly tried to ban laughter? His story, for all its sensationalism, offers a quiet reflection on the nature of power, control, and the indomitable spirit of human nature, even under the most unusual circumstances. First, his reign is a testament to the idea that absolute power, when wielded without wisdom or understanding of cultural norms, can quickly become self-destructive. He had the authority to do almost anything, but lacked the judgment to understand the consequences of his actions. Imagine having all the resources of the Roman Empire at your fingertips and deciding to spend them on a revolving dining room and marrying your god to Minerva. It's a compelling, if slightly unsettling, thought. This is a mainstream historical fact that echoes throughout history. Power without principle rarely lasts. Second, Elagabalus's story, particularly the ban on laughter, serves as a quirky tidbit that highlights the inherent human need for expression and joy. You can legislate against a lot of things, but trying to suppress genuine human emotions like laughter or love is a fool's errand. It's like trying to hold back the tide with a teacup. The very absurdity of the idea underscores the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the most oppressive environments, people find ways to connect, to find humor, and to express themselves, even if it's in hushed tones or knowing glances. The idea that joy can be banned is something that sounds amusingly tyrannical, almost like a cartoon villain's plot. And yet it was apparently a reality for a short, unsettling time in Rome. Finally, Elagabalus's legacy, constantly re-evaluated by historians, reminds us that history itself is a fluid narrative. The way we interpret the past changes with our present understanding and our evolving values. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus was truly a malevolent force, a misunderstood religious figure, or simply a deeply troubled young man. Was he a cautionary tale about unchecked imperial power, or a tragic figure whose unconventional identity clashed violently with the rigid expectations of his time? This continuous debate, this slow, scholarly unraveling of ancient prejudices and assumptions can be quite soothing in itself, as we ponder the complexities of human nature across millennia. It's a reminder that even the boring parts of history can hold profound insights. As the echoes of ancient Rome fade, and the peculiar image of an emperor trying to stifle a chuckle drifts from your mind, allow yourself to simply relax. The weight of historical intrigue can now gently lift. Imagine the soft rustle of ancient togas, the gentle splash of the Tiber, and the distant muffled sounds of a city settling down for the night. Let the subtle hum of the past lull you into a state of peaceful contemplation, as you remember that even in the strangest of times, the simple act of a quiet breath, a gentle sigh, or even a suppressed smile remains.